Welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed the program so far. I'd like to thank Frank Malloy for running the Bicentennial Games, the Minister, the Shadow Minister, Team Dan, Team Tanya. One bit of feedback I had is it's great to see these politicians being themselves. So thank you very much for that bit of fun, complementing the entertainment we're having during the breaks. Let me also thank Professor John Haldane for his contribution, and we now move towards the panel discussion. Now, to facilitate that discussion will be Geraldine Doogue. Geraldine Doogue AO is a renowned Australian journalist and broadcaster, much loved for her work reporting on religious and social affairs. Geraldine has carved out an enviable reputation for herself across print, television and radio, working on the Australian newspaper, the ABC's Nationwide, 2UE, Channel 10 News and hosting the ABC TV's Compass program. In her ongoing roles, Geraldine continues to tackle a wide range of subjects with rigour, optimism, humour and warmth. Please welcome Geraldine Doogue.
And thank you, Jacinta, very much indeed. And of course, I'm stunned by the breakout of bipartisanship on display in the Bicentennial Games, with the unity ticket being offered by Tanya Plibersek to the Minister. It was great fun, and I must say, I did quite well. We were there in the control room doing it as well. But yes, I think the Minister said, let's have more of this, and I have to agree. I thought it was absolutely marvellous and a terrific idea. I didn't know whether Frank Malloy, the quizmaster, looked entirely comfortable all the time with the administering the rules. I think he felt under pressure. Now, I'm going to invite we've got a fabulous array. I think this will be a really good discussion until 2:30. I want to introduce the panel participants to you as we try to sort of continue what I understand has been very much a theme about hope for the future and where you're heading. I want to introduce Glenn Fahey, Dr. Glenn Fahey from the Centre for Independent Studies and co-author on the policy paper Pain Without Gain, Why School Closures Are Bad Policy. It's a very interesting paper which I'll refer to often. Carmel Nash OAM, Executive Director of the Catholic School Parents from Queensland. Matthew Brennan, a Principal at St Augustine's College in Cairns. Carmelina Eussen, who's Principal of Casimir Catholic College from Marrickville. And Sam Wright, who's Vice Principal of the students of Padua College on the Mornington Peninsula, of course, who've sort of very much been at the cutting edge. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to Sam. So look, thank you very much for joining us all today. And we'll go through a number of things. I do invite you, by the way, to sort of, I'll get essential remarks, but the more we can make this a conversation, I think the better it'll be. So do, keep it down to a relatively civilised, but do feel free to interrupt and I'll go with you. So let's get to that question about the impact of COVID through remote learning, particularly on vulnerable and at-risk students, and what we might have learned in terms of addressing the widening gap for disadvantaged people. Now, the CIS paper that I referred to, Dr. Fahey's paper, found the approximate impact of a term of school closures for disadvantaged students range from 1.5 weeks, 1.5 weeks, to 3.3 weeks of lost learning, depending on subject and year level. So it was quite sort of granular here. And clearly Victoria has been, we assume, we'll find out, been one of the most affected states with longer periods of remote learning. I'm wondering how schools have identified most at-risk students or most vulnerable students, and how you do try, because you've had to adapt on the run to address this disadvantage and to support them. So maybe, Glenn, I could ask you first, please. If you could just give a very quick outline of what you found and whether it surprised you or not.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me, Geraldine, and thanks to everybody that's part of the discussion here. I hope it's a good one. In terms of what we found and how that process went for us, so we were, like everybody, have been very concerned to identify what the nature of the learning loss is, so both the scale and the scope. So in terms of scale, this is as you've mentioned, about how far behind might our most disadvantaged students fall behind during this period. And our research suggests that in Victoria, with the extended closures, we'd suggest that that's around 6 weeks on average. And I have to stress that that's an average, right? So that means that there are going to be students on either side of that, some of whom are going to be in a really difficult situation and may have had real difficulties in making any progress at all during this time in Victoria, and others that have done not quite as bad as we would predict in a worst case scenario. The other question is that of scope. So we did some follow-up research that also asked the composition of where students might be. Around 40% of students we think are likely to have fallen behind. Around 40% are likely to have progressed roughly the same as where they would have in class, particularly those that were closed in only a shorter time period. And there's perhaps around 20% that are likely to have potentially learned a little more, or they've done remarkably well while they've been at home, which is also something that I think is certainly a surprise from our end, and I hope that that's something that is observed in the classroom as well.
Well, I mean, that's very interesting, and we'll come. Well, maybe I should ask you that right at the start. Are you comfortable with what you've seen in the patterns of those who have done that 20% better than you expected?
Well, I think it's early days. A lot's going to be learned in the next few weeks, in particular in Victoria. And I think that this is a really critical time, this last portion of the year. And so I'd really encourage teachers in those schools to take this period as a really important learning opportunity to find out more about those students who have done quite well. Why is it that they've done well? Is it just that they had quite supportive opportunities at home during home-based learning? Or is there more about their learning styles and things that then we can then further build upon those capabilities with those students, so that going back to class isn't like, going back to normal, but also an opportunity for them to continue to practice out those skills and that they've found to be useful during that period. So they shouldn't be forgotten as well when we're looking at the students that have fallen behind too.
And look, I'll go to others in a moment, but I just want one more from your paper, which I found terribly interesting, was the digital technology, what we've learned about digital technology in education, because you make the point in your paper that it's still terribly fluid as a way of trying to draw definite conclusions, but it's absolutely been on trial here. So what would you say?
I think it's a reminder of something that we already know, and that's that technology is both friend and foe in education. We've still got a lot to learn about how do we best integrate technology as a supporter and not a substitute of what we're already doing well in school. And that's really, it's a work in progress. And I think that I'm really excited that there's been an opportunity here to trial some of those, some really great innovations out during this period of time. It's a matter of gaining those learnings and then continuing that good practice that's already out there in the years to come, and really having a positive relationship with technology.
Matthew, how would you say, up in Cairns, what have you witnessed, would you say, or are you not even prepared to draw conclusions? It's just still too fluid?
Look, Geraldine, thanks for that. Look, it is very early, but I'd take a lot of the points that Glenn has said, and I congratulate you too, Glenn, on reading the document that you've put together. Interestingly, we speak about technology. It's often been said that technology is a revolution that's still coming, and it's been said for sort of 50 odd years now. So technology was obviously something that was a challenge for some of our students vulnerable. We were finding up in Cairns, being a boarding school and having students on the Torres Strait, things like connectivity, and that some of those students were already at risk, but we were supplying dongles and all the students had their own school-issued laptops, but even having to post work, there was a lot of phone calls home to people. One of the things QCAA did so well, though, I think, around this was for our senior students, they reduced the internal assessments from 3 to 2, which had a huge impact on the students and also the staff as far as workload goes. The other thing that we tried to do we identify our vulnerable or at-risk local students. They were welcome to come to the school during the school day, and being a boarding school, we had a lot of staff who weren't engaged in their normal form of employment, so we're supervising those students. So, and a student at risk could have been somebody as simply as a parent ringing and saying, I can't get my child out of bed, he won't get on the computer, he's not doing what he should be doing. We saw them as vulnerable and we encouraged them to come and join us.
But did they?
Yeah, well, again, that comes back to parenting, doesn't it? But a number did, yes, absolutely.
And because that is a very interesting thing about whether they did better being hybrid, you know, on site and work, according to Glenn's paper, and home, or whether it was better on site, because it certainly was not a typical school experience, even if they were on site, was it? Absolutely,
Geraldine. And interestingly, you say, because there really was everybody was somewhere different on the spectrum. We had and we surveyed the boys and parents regularly, and we found some boys actually thrived in the environment at home. We weren't as regimented as some other schools around timetables for the day. We left a lot of that to families, given we didn't know what was happening behind the closed doors of homes. And certainly some boys said that the self-paced learning was something that they really enjoyed and thrived in. In fact, some parents and students tried to negotiate a 4-day week and have 1 day at home, which obviously hasn't happened.
Fascinating. Now, Sam Wright, you've really been at the cutting edge in Victoria. How have you found it?
Look, it has been very challenging, but...
Just can't hear you properly, Sam. We might just have to... I still can't hear you properly. We're just going to try to get that... You just sound... I can see you, but I just can't quite... we're nearly there, I think. We're about... Do you want me to just... we'll go to Carmelina while we just get work. So, Carmelina, how would you answer that from Marrickville?
Hi, Geraldine. Hi, everyone. Happy World Teachers' Day. Well, I think interesting what Matthew shared with us about the structure and the routine. In our meetings and discussions with parents, they were really craving for us to continue to have routine and structure. So that's the way we went. We tried to mirror as much as possible the same timetable that they would have had at school. So they would get up, same time, they would touch base with their homeroom teacher, and the role of that homeroom teacher was absolutely crucial. It wasn't just about marking the roll, but it was about, praying with them to start the day. It was about looking out, who was here, who was up, who wasn't up. And it was about really touching base and looking at, well, who's not coping with this remote learning.
And did you draw yourself conclusions about that?
Look, we did. The statistics are quite interesting. 20% did better because some of our students loved being at home. But of course, they weren't at home for a long time. But it would be interesting to see what, a longitudinal study would be in terms of what they would say if it was for longer. I think our students, at first were a little bit excited about the remote learning, but after a while they were really missing the social interactions. They were missing their friends, believe it or not, they were missing their teachers, and they were actually, wanting to come back to school. And I clearly remember their first day back, even though their return was staggered. I remember when the whole community had returned and there was a real sense of excitement, and they were really happy to be here.
Okay, now I haven't been given the nod yet that we've actually got Sam back, but I'll just go to one thing to Carmel. I'll go to Carmel Nash, Executive Director of Catholic School Parents Queensland, because what is interesting in Glenn's paper, Carmel, is that, there's been a lot of discussion around this issue of digital, and I'm just trying to get down to who might be suffering and who's not. One of the definite pluses, or two of the definite pluses, were there was more feedback given in this arrangement, and there was more adaptability. Now, I just wonder whether you agree that has been on display, and whether you think that is something that particularly benefits disadvantaged kids, or do you have to be already advantaged to get the benefit of that?
I think there's a mix of things in there, Geraldine, and happy World Teachers' Day to all the wonderful teachers online. I think that for those families that were already engaged with their children's education and really connected to school,
yep.
I think there was a very different thing from those that aren't as engaged or connected for many reasons. We heard stories of families, you know, with 4 children and 1 phone. You know, those sorts of things were difficult, but I think that schools went a really long way to get paper work to those kids, but then the ability of those families to know how to support, how far to go, those sorts of things were missing. But then I heard wonderful stories of, you know, teachers going to the front gates of houses when they couldn't go inside, checking in. You know, the phone call every week to families, and if they hadn't heard from someone, calling that family to make sure everything was okay. And on top of that, of course, were all the families who lost their jobs and how they were coping at home, you know, trying to look for a job, as well as those that had a job and were trying to do their work. So, you know, parents told us all sorts of things about how they managed their day, and what was exciting was they learnt so much more about their children. They learned who was an independent learner, who wasn't. What was their optimal learning time? And one mum was telling me that she was getting up at 5:30 when her son woke up, because that was the optimal time for him. And they got in, he was primary school, they did the work, and then they would go for a walk or do other activities. So I think there's such a range of things involved in what occurred during this time. But I think for me, how do we continue that engagement of families? How do we build on that now? We know so much. You know, and families know now, they've said things to me like, the school had an evening where we could go and look at how they taught maths, which is very different from what most of us did, and we didn't go. And now we know we should have been there. So how do we build on those things? How do we keep that feedback happening and don't just cut it off now that they're back at school? So I think those things are really important.
Well, that's really interesting, that collaborative, you know, building on the possible collaboration. Now, I think we've got Sam back, I'm very glad to say. So, Sam, you know, speaking from Victoria, how would you answer?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things in celebrating 200 years of Catholic education, I think one of the things recognising first and foremost that how, you know, in identifying vulnerable students, that we do partial care and wellbeing so well in Catholic schools. So there wasn't a great deal of surprises on who we thought would be vulnerable or disadvantaged. So I think that was really important. And you know, Victoria, obviously Metro Victoria, as a vice principal of students of a 3-campus college of 2,500 students, we've got to recognise that whatever we put in place to recognise, to connect or to engage actually has to be there by design and not by default. So, you know, we work, Catholic Education Melbourne's got a wellbeing framework called Excel, which is really preferences enabling connection, engagement and learning. So certainly knowing that and identifying those ones that are students that are vulnerable. Over that time, there were, you know, almost like different goalposts for Victorian lockdown. We had some students on, then we had stage 4 lockdowns. We tried to collate, and I know the other panellists have spoken about, you know, connecting with families, but also collecting data evidence. We were doing wellness check-ins and collating engagement data to actually see how the kids are tracking. And as Glenn had said, there were some students that had really gone well, and there were some students that did, you know, probably highlight a need for more connection, which then forced partial teams and things like that to make the connection. We had students on site for the, you know, on-site essential workers and things like that. We identified those ones that would benefit from some partial on-site, off-site, just to check in with our staff. And
Sam,
this didn't happen or couldn't work.
Can I just, so that's obviously quite a lot of discernment underway. Did you all do that as a, if you had to distill it, how did you make all of those decisions?
Look, a whole school approach works when you've got the teams working together. So, you know, I'm part of a fantastic leadership team, and I've got fantastic leaders underneath me as well. So we collect the data, we collect the evidence, we look at how students are tracking both in engagement, their connectedness, how they're going in classes, and we share that. We use Microsoft Teams, Google Meets, things like that to share that data. And where does that raise flags? Where does that, you know, would a phone call home or an invitation in work with this student? Would extra support, a one-on-one Google Meet with our IC team, or even, you know, some telehealth services with our counselling staff made up of school counsellors, psychologists, and so on and so forth. So it's certainly, you know, the function of our leadership team, high functioning, working around all these different areas, learning staff, our mission and identity, as well as students.
So that's a great deal of management involved in that, though, isn't there?
Yeah, when I saw Glenn's title of his paper, and I thought it was fantastic, schools closed. Well, I don't think schools were closed in Victoria. If you look at the email traffic in the ICT room, the server room, I think our staff have worked certainly harder than they have before, just making those connections, responding to emails. And what you could do in person in a classroom, you can't follow up with 25 individual emails straight after the class. So we are now at that point of how can we learn from these situations.
That's a lot, isn't it? I'm just going to go back to Glenn quickly before I move on to the mental health aspects, because you do make the point that the digital divide, most definitely, we know that exists in Australia, and this is Australian, the ACER research, with poorer families and those in remote locations being relatively disadvantaged. Now, I just wonder how you think the pandemic has shown that up. I mean, have we made progress there, or has it become sort of blindingly obvious that this is a major issue which we've really got to focus on more? How would you answer that?
Look, I think it's absolutely shown up an existing weakness around digital divides, both with students, home infrastructure, school infrastructure, teachers' confidence in using technology, and with parents' ability to support their child's learning through having the right equipment and how to help them to access and use technology. So there's a range of digital divides, not just one. And I think this has certainly been a time when it's shown that up. The silver lining, I hope, is that there's something to come from this that helps to re-emphasize that it is here to stay. Technology is here to stay, and it is a part of education. It'll never be all of education, but will always be part of it. So how do we now go forward and ensure that it is a constructive part of it?
Because you do say that OECD data shows that while we regularly use technology for classwork and projects, Australian teachers are underprepared when it comes to utilising technology for broader teaching practices, and that in fact our large-scale online activity by and large in Australia has been poor. And so that this has really been a wake-up call. Is that how you see it in a way?
Absolutely. And where that divide exists actually is quite interesting. Our students are actually some of the most tech savvy in the whole world, which I'm sure teachers here will attest to. But the school level infrastructure and confidence with an integration of technology is behind where other similar countries are. I don't think that's by design.
Why do you think that is?
Look, I don't think it's by kind of explicit design. I think part of it reflects remoteness in Australia and the divides in terms of delivering education to a geographically dispersed country. I think, unfortunately, that's a factor of that, which is different to many other similar countries to us. But there's also appears to be, in my view, some level of unwillingness in some sectors within education to really get on board with technology. And I think that there's an element there that we've got some work to do in convincing everybody to get on board and perhaps, as I say, this could be a realization that that's a reality we have to deal with, not just to excuse away use of technology.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, let's move to mental health. And we know the mental health and wellbeing of students and the stress of teachers and staff has been a significant issue during the pandemic. I mean, it's breathtaking, really, listening to you all, to be honest, as to what you've all had to adapt to. And I'm wondering, at your schools, I'll ask each of you, you know, what do you think, Judge, to have been the key factor in the strategies that you've implemented around this? Matthew, in Cairns?
Thanks, Geraldine. Look, we got together as a leadership team as we knew the pandemic was on its way and school closures were imminent, and devised a document, the Continuity of Learning Plan, and what was underpinning all of that was the wellbeing of the community. John Hattie put out an interesting study or a blog in early April where he mentioned that don't panic if kids miss, 10 weeks of school. He looked at some data from the Christchurch earthquakes of 2011. So one of the things, as I said, we were absolutely acutely aware of was the wellbeing of everybody. And as I mentioned earlier, I like Carmelina's school. We did have the boys checking in at 8:30 with a prayer and a thumbs up, basically on Teams. If they hadn't done it for 2 days, we had their friends contact them via social media. If we didn't have something by the lunchtime of that day, we made contact. But we're acutely aware that we had parents as well who had lost jobs, parents who were using their sons as workers. We had older students who were looking after younger siblings. So we really had to ensure that the wellbeing of families were taken care of. I think one of the things, though, that hit us very early was, as a leadership team of the school, our priority had to be to look after the people who are looking after the kids. Right. And that's obviously our teachers. So for many, they'd never used Zoom, they'd never used team meetings. So we spent a bit of time, there was no pressure to use that initially, particularly in the first 2 weeks. There was a lot of in-house training. We were calling them pop-up PDs and small group professional reading groups where they were learning these skills. Some of them, as you mentioned around technology earlier, some of them were very reluctant to use OneNote and things like that, but were forced out of their comfort zone. So we were acutely aware as a leadership team that we had to be looking after the teachers. So there was a lot of opportunities. We were very lucky in the sense that the age of our staff is varied like all schools, but the staff came into school every day. Yes, they were working in some ways in silos, but there was opportunities to come together, socially distancing, of course, but we were putting on meals and care packages for staff and, drinks in small groups. So we were really focused on the staff, and I've got to say, like I'm sure at all schools, they did a remarkable job. But as I said, the wellbeing of the families was important too. So there was a lot of conversations with parents, but we're also very, very mindful and understanding that we weren't aware of what all families were going through, and our primary focus or our core underpinning of everything was their wellbeing.
Terrific. And Carmel, how would you answer that?
I agree, and I think that notion that we have to take care of the whole family, because if you're looking after the kids at school but the family is crumbling at home, then that's a very difficult thing for a young person to deal with. So that really care for the whole family, I think, was crucial. And what we said to families in the time that they were schools were closed, and many families were able to send their kids to school because our schools were so welcoming. But for those at home, we just said to them, do what you can, but don't ruin your relationship with your child. Fighting over maths or whatever, work out the way they're going to work and do it, but don't destroy that relationship. And I think it's important to remember that whilst we talk a lot about literacy and numeracy, it would be really good to think about what are the other things kids learned when they were at home.
Yeah.
Because we've seen they cooked, and I've had a very well-known person in Queensland say to me that she had never expected her children to help with anything at home. And now they all do chores. Well, they wouldn't have done that otherwise. So I think there are a lot of positives. And, someone else said that they've never really, because of their working hours, participated at school. And now they participate more, have taken on some roles, and their kids are so excited. So, you know, we can't just look at everything as being negative. There were some absolute positives, but we know that kids are worried and we know that families are worried, but how we deal with that is the important thing, and the whole family is crucial.
That's very interesting. Matthew, I'm sorry, yes. Carmelina is what I'm trying to say. Carmelina, how would you see it?
Well, I think I was just appointed as a new principal this year, so 5 weeks in, did not know the community that well, so I really needed to prioritise time to listen, to get to know the community really well. And even on the weekends sometimes, you know, staff would have to contact me to talk things through about what was going on, you know, in their own lives that actually was affecting what was happening here at school.
Did that happen very often? Did people come to you very often?
Well, absolutely, yes. And that was important. Making myself available was important, being present, knowing, allowing them to know that it was okay to contact me.
Right.
But I think Matthew made the point that, you know, surround yourself with a very strong leadership team, and so that you're all on the same page. And that's exactly what happened where I am here. We all came together. We all had a common goal. A contingency plan, mitigation plan was put into place. It was accessible, constantly reviewed, allowed for questions, because every day there were new questions.
Wow.
And for the students, you know, the staff were very good at knowing who our students at risk were and are.
That's what I've been very impressed with, I've got to say, that you all were, you know, you're reflecting that consistently, that you all did have a fairly good sense of who was going to be most at risk. Look, if you don't mind, I'm just going to cut you off, Carmel, because I'm just watching. I've only got 2 and a bit minutes to go, and I just want to hear Sam's thoughts too about this.
Yeah, I'm picking up on Carmel's point that there were some great things happening at home, and what we were tried to leverage was celebrating those opportunities, commending them, like being the competitions. We had bake-offs and photography competitions and things like that students earned house points to build up their connection. We also, with that collecting that data we had in relation to the wellness, and so we'd regularly check in with our students, as the other schools did, but utilising that to look at their character strengths, how they're feeling emotionally, some tongue-in-cheek questions, what we thought were funny but were really kind of dad jokes, but recognising their challenges, giving opportunities for sharing their, you know, what they're grateful for. So that was shared on a regular basis with the team. So those check-ins were that data that we collected and the learnings and reflections from there. So that was really important to make that connection. And then we had changed over time as well. So we adapted our programs and how we did it as the lockdown increased. But it was certainly about every opportunity for engagement and connection with our students and doing that Maslow stuff before the Bloom stuff.
All right, now look, I'm just going to go to Glenn for a very quick final. It's a minute you've got, Glenn, because you say Australia's schools should have been better prepared to handle this. How could they have been?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there was and has been a reluctance to take seriously equipping ourselves for technology. Now, no one could have predicted that there would be a pandemic and we would need to upgrade as quickly as we needed to in this situation. But I think it is important to recognise that we were behind the curve in terms of preparedness because we'd had a little bit of a negative bias when it comes to technology, but it's also because we've also been behind the curve a little bit when it comes to constructive engagement with parents. And I can say that coming out of this, we've actually have observed that more than 50% of parents say they've got really more positive views about the education system coming out of this experience, which I think is really great. But what I haven't yet seen is a commitment to see that engagement with parents that was so successful during this time is something that's part of everyday practice. And I hope that that's something that we see here.
Well, very interesting, and this is your paper that I've got the front page of. I do urge people to read it. Pain Without Gain, Why School Closure is a Bad Policy. Look, I've really enjoyed that. I hope teachers have got something from it. So I want to thank Glenn Fahey, Carmel Nash, Matthew Brennan, Carmelina Eussen and Sam Wright. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much indeed. Yes, probably. Have I ended too early? Could we have gone on? No, probably not. I've really found that fascinating. Thank you all and congratulations. Honestly, I think it's just been a Herculean effort. Thanks very much.